Cold-hearted billionaire falls for her in the rain. Must-watch romance. My dear and precious viewers, welcome back to Alcott Stories channel. For another beautiful story, I pour my heart and soul into creating these emotional, heart-touching stories just for you. Every word, every scene, and every twist is crafted with love and dedication, because you deserve the best. But today, I have to share something from my heart. I'm feeling really upset. I work tirelessly day and night to bring you quality content, gripping stories, and unforgettable moments. But despite all my efforts, many of my lovely viewers are not subscribing to the channel. I've always told you, I am nothing without your support. You are my motivation, my strength, and my biggest inspiration. Your love and encouragement are what keep me going. So, if you enjoy my stories, if my content touches your heart, please support me by subscribing to the channel. It's just a small click for you, but for me, it means the world. Let's grow together. Let's create more beautiful stories, and let's make this journey unforgettable. Now sit back, relax, and get ready for another emotional roller coaster. The night was unforgiving. The sky, once clear and star-strewn, was now a black abyss, choked with rolling storm clouds that crackled with lightning. The rain pounded relentlessly against the streets of New York, turning the city into a shimmering maze of reflections and shadows. Inside, his sleek black Rolls-Royce, Alexander Knight sat in the back seat, his fingers drumming impatiently against the leather armrest. His jaw clenched as he checked the time on his Rolex. The high-profile business meeting had drained his patience, and now, of all times, his car had chosen to break down. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. His driver, Carl, stepped out, already drenched within seconds, and lifted the hood. "Sir, there's a problem with the engine. It might take a while." Alexander let out a slow, irritated sigh. He wasn't a man used to delays. He ran on precision, control, and dominance. But tonight, the universe seemed to mock him. With another sigh, he pushed the door open, stepping into the rain. The icy droplets struck his expensive suit, seeping through the fine fabric, but he barely flinched. His sharp blue eyes scanned the nearly deserted street, neon lights flickering in puddles along the sidewalks. That's when he saw her. A young woman, Emily Carter, struggling against the storm. She clutched a stack of paintings close to her chest, her thin coat doing little to shield her from the downpour. The wind howled, ripping one of the paintings from her grasp, sending it spiraling through the air before landing in a dirty puddle. "Damn it!" she gasped, scrambling after it, her dark curls plastered to her face. Alexander found himself watching, captivated by the scene. Something about her desperation, her resilience, intrigued him. She was soaked to the bone, shivering, yet determined. He should have ignored her, he should have turned away. But he didn't. Instead, he took a step forward. Emily grabbed the ruined painting, her hands trembling as she tried to wipe off the dirt. But it was too late. The colors bled, the image destroyed. She let out a sharp breath, frustration and exhaustion evident in her hunched shoulders. Then, as if the universe had one final cruel joke to play, her knees buckled. Alexander's body moved before his mind did. He caught her. His arms wrapped around her just as she collapsed, her weight feather-light against him. Up close, he noticed the dark circles beneath her eyes, the way her lips quivered from the cold. She smelled like rain, oil paint, and something faintly floral. "Miss!" His voice was deep, commanding yet oddly gentle. Her lashes fluttered, her hazel eyes barely opening. I just need a second," she whispered. But her body betrayed her, her head lolling against his chest. Alexander cursed under his breath. He was not a man who involved himself in the affairs of strangers. He had no time for distractions. Yet here he was, standing in the middle of a rainstorm, holding a fragile woman in his arms. Carl hurried over, eyes wide. "Sir, should I—" "Open the car," Alexander ordered. "But the engine, just do it." Within moments he was carrying Emily into the warmth of the Rolls-Royce. She let out a soft sigh as he set her down, her drenched clothes clinging to her. For a brief moment, he just stared at her, trying to understand why he had intervened. He didn't even know her name. He could have walked away. He should have. But something about this girl, this stormy night, felt different, and Alexander Knight never ignored his instincts. A sharp gasp escaped Emily's lips as her eyes fluttered open. She wasn't outside in the rain anymore. Instead, she lay on a king-sized bed, the sheets softer than anything she had ever touched. The warm glow of dim lighting replaced the cold darkness of the storm. The scent of expensive cologne and polished wood filled the air. Her heart pounded. Where was she? Slowly, she pushed herself up, her damp curls clinging to her skin. Her clothes, still slightly wet from the rain, stuck to her like a second skin. Panic started to rise in her chest until her gaze fell on the sprawling view beyond the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The New York skyline stretched out before her, glittering like a sea of stars. She was in a penthouse, a very expensive one. Before she could process anything further, the door creaked open. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped inside, his presence commanding the room effortlessly. His icy blue eyes locked onto hers, sending a shiver down her spine. His suit jacket was gone, leaving him in a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, veins visible along his strong forearms. Emily knew exactly who he was. Alexander Knight. Her breath caught in her throat. The billionaire. The ruthless businessman. The man feared by rivals and employees alike. The man who had saved her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. His gaze scanned her, calculating, unreadable. Then he took slow, deliberate steps toward the bed, stopping just a few feet away. "You're awake," he said, his deep voice smooth, but laced with something she couldn't quite place. Emily swallowed hard. Where am I?" "My penthouse," Alexander replied simply, watching her reaction. She blinked in disbelief. "You're—" "What?" "You collapsed in the rain," he continued, slipping his hands into his pockets. "I wasn't about to leave you there." Emily's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She remembered the storm, her paintings, the overwhelming exhaustion that had finally taken over. But waking up here, in his home, felt unreal. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured, gripping the blanket around her. Alexander tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharp. "Clearly you wouldn't have made it far on your own." His bluntness made her bristle. "I would have been fine," she muttered, more to convince herself than him. A ghost of a smirk flickered across his lips, but it was gone in an instant. "If you say so." Emily exhaled, trying to steady herself. She needed to leave. The longer she stayed, the more uncomfortable she felt under his piercing gaze. "Thank you for helping me," she said, swinging her legs over the bed. The plush rug beneath her bare feet felt almost too luxurious. "But I should go." Alexander's eyes darkened slightly, but he didn't stop her. Instead, he simply watched as she stood up, wobbling slightly before regaining her balance. "You should eat something before you go," he said, almost as an afterthought. Emily shook her head. "I'll be fine." Something flickered in his expression, something unreadable. But he didn't argue. Carl, his driver, appeared at the doorway. "Sir, should I arrange a car for the lady?" Alexander's jaw tightened for a brief moment before he gave a small nod. Emily hesitated, glancing at him one last time. She had heard stories about Alexander Knight, cold, ruthless, unforgiving. Yet, tonight, he had saved her life. "Thank you again," she said softly. He didn't respond. He simply nodded, his gaze following her as she walked past him, and just like that, she was gone. But as Alexander stood there in the silence of his penthouse, he found himself doing something he never did. Thinking about a woman, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The grand ballroom of the Knight Empire Hotel was nothing short of breathtaking. Chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, their golden light casting an ethereal glow across the polished marble floors. Elite businessmen and socialites mingled, sipping champagne and discussing multi-million-dollar deals. In the midst of this world of wealth and power, Emily Carter stood at the far end of the ballroom, adjusting the floral arrangements on one of the lavishly decorated tables. She was still struggling to believe she was here. Just days ago, she had woken up in Alexander Knight's penthouse, feeling like an outsider in a world too luxurious for her. And now, fate had brought her back into his orbit. She had gotten this job through sheer luck. A friend had recommended her for the event's decor team, and needing the money, she had jumped at the opportunity. But never in her wildest dreams had she expected to run into him again. And yet, there he was. Alexander Knight stood at the far side of the ballroom, surrounded by powerful executives, exuding the same intimidating aura he always did. Tall, confident, and impossibly handsome, he wore a black-tailored suit that fit him like a second skin. His icy blue eyes surveyed the room with indifference, as if nothing here truly interested him. Nothing, until his gaze landed on her. Emily felt it before she even turned around, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She swallowed hard and forced herself to keep working. She wasn't supposed to be here to admire him. She was here to do a job. But Alexander? He was no longer listening to the conversation around him. The moment he saw Emily, standing amidst the crowd in a simple yet elegant black dress, adjusting a floral centerpiece, something shifted inside him. It was unexpected, and that irritated him. Mr. Knight, one of his associates, James Halford, interrupted his thoughts. Alexander blinked, his jaw tightening. "What? You seem distracted." James smirked, following his gaze. Then he let out a low chuckle. "Ah, I see. The decor girl." Alexander shot him a sharp look that silenced him instantly. "Mind your own business, James." James smirked but wisely backed off. Alexander turned his attention back to Emily, watching as she moved gracefully, oblivious to the storm she had just stirred within him. He should ignore her. But he didn't. Instead, he started walking. Emily carefully adjusted the last flower arrangement, then stepped back to inspect her work. "Not bad," she murmured to herself. "Not bad at all," a deep voice said behind her. She froze. The voice was smooth, rich, and dangerously familiar. Slowly, she turned and her breath hitched. Alexander. Standing too close. His presence sent a wave of heat through her. The way his sharp blue eyes assessed her made her feel vulnerable, as if he could see straight through her. "You work here?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. Emily cleared her throat, trying to ignore the way her heart slammed against her ribs. "Just for tonight, a temporary job." Alexander arched a brow. "Is that so?" She nodded, gripping her hands together. "I wasn't expecting to run into you again." A hint of amusement flickered in his gaze. "And yet here we are." His voice was low and smooth, sending a shiver down her spine. Emily had read about men like him, powerful, magnetic, dangerously charming. She had never imagined she'd be standing this close to one. "Well," she said, forcing a polite smile, "I should probably get back to work." She turned to leave. But then, "Emily," he said. She froze. He had never said her name before. Slowly, she turned back to him, her pulse racing. Alexander's gaze softened, just slightly, something flickering in his eyes that she couldn't quite read. "You never told me why you were out in the rain that night," he said. Emily swallowed hard. Why did he care? "It doesn't matter," she said quietly. "Maybe not to you," he said, stepping closer, "but it does to me." Her breath caught. Why? Why did he care? Emily held his gaze for a long moment, trying to decipher the man before her. This was dangerous. He was dangerous. And yet, she found herself drawn to him, just as she had been that night in the storm. "Mr. Knight," she said, forcing herself to be professional, "I appreciate what you did for me, but you and we're from two different worlds." A shadow of a smirk played on his lips. "Are we?" "Yes," she said firmly. "And I don't belong in yours." Alexander studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he gave her a slow nod. "If you say so," he murmured. And then, just like that, he turned and walked away. Emily exhaled sharply, feeling like she had just survived a hurricane, but even as she went back to work, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. And that thought terrified her. Alexander walked back toward his group, but his mind was still on her, Emily Carter. There was something about her, something he shouldn't be interested in, but he was, and that was a problem. A very, very dangerous problem. Emily had barely settled into her tiny apartment when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and froze. Alexander Knight. How did he even get her number? Her heart hammered as she debated whether to answer. Against her better judgment, she picked up. "Hello?" "Meet me for dinner," his voice came through, smooth and commanding as ever. Emily blinked. No greeting, no explanation, just an order. She scoffed, shifting the phone to her other ear. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," he replied, completely unfazed. She crossed her arms. "And why exactly would I do that?" A pause. Then his voice dropped lower. "Because I haven't stopped thinking about you." Her breath caught. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. The cold, ruthless billionaire admitting something so vulnerable. Impossible. "Mr. Knight." "Alexander," he corrected. She frowned. "What?" "Call me Alexander." She swallowed, his name feeling foreign yet oddly intimate on her tongue. "Look," she said, exhaling, "I don't think dinner is a good idea. We come from completely different worlds." "I know," he admitted, "and yet I still want to see you." Her pulse quickened. This was dangerous, this was stupid, and yet... She found herself saying, "Fine, one dinner, that's it." A soft chuckle rumbled through the phone. "I'll pick you up at 7. Before she could argue, the line went dead. Emily stared at her phone, heart racing. What had she just agreed to? By the time 7 p.m. rolled around, Emily was a bundle of nerves. She stood outside her tiny apartment complex, feeling ridiculously out of place in the elegant navy blue dress she'd borrowed from her best friend. Then a sleek black Rolls-Royce pulled up in front of her. Of course, The driver stepped out to open the door, but before he could, Alexander did it himself. The sight of him stole her breath. Dressed in a tailored black suit, he looked devastatingly handsome, his sharp features illuminated under the streetlights. For a moment, all she could do was stare. "Are you going to get in?" he asked, amusement dancing in his eyes. Snapping out of her trance, she cleared her throat and slid inside. As soon as the door closed, the scent of his cologne, something expensive, dark, and intoxicating, wrapped around her. "This isn't a good idea," she murmured. Alexander smirked. "And yet you're here." She shot him a glare. "That doesn't mean I'm impressed." His chuckle was low and dangerously smooth. "We'll see about that." The car glided through the city streets, heading toward the most exclusive restaurant in New York. Of course, he would take her somewhere extravagant. And yet when they arrived, she was surprised. It wasn't a stuffy five-star establishment filled with businessmen. Instead, it was a charming, intimate Italian restaurant tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. Candle-lit tables, soft jazz playing in the background, the scent of fresh bread and wine. Emily blinked. "There's unexpected." Alexander placed his hand on the small of her back, guiding her inside. "You assumed I'd take you somewhere predictable." "Yes," she admitted. He smirked. "Then I guess I like surprising you." And damn it, that was dangerous. The evening shouldn't have been easy. She had expected tension, awkwardness, maybe even a cold, business-like dinner where he lost interest halfway through. Instead, she found herself laughing. He was sharp, witty, and surprisingly thoughtful. "You paint for a living?" he asked after their appetizers arrived. She nodded. "Trying to. I sell a few pieces here and there, but it's not exactly stable." He studied her, his gaze intense. "And yet you don't quit." She shrugged. "Art isn't something you just quit. It's part of who I am." Alexander didn't respond immediately. He simply watched her, as if seeing her in a way no one else ever had. "Most people chase money," he finally said. "You chase passion." She smirked. "Says the billionaire." To her shock, he actually chuckled. And God, his laugh! It was rare, rough, and utterly disarming. "I wasn't always like this," he admitted, leaning back in his chair. "There was a time when money didn't mean everything to me." Emily arched a brow. "And now?" His expression darkened, but just for a second. "Now, it's all I know." Her heart twisted at the weight behind those words. For the first time, she saw the man behind the empire. Not just a ruthless billionaire, but a man who had lost something important along the way. And that realization unnerved her. By the time dessert arrived, the air between them had shifted. The conversation had slowed. The stolen glances had lingered longer. Emily felt it, and so did Alexander. As she reached for her glass of wine, her fingers brushed against his. She froze. His gaze locked onto hers, something unreadable flickering in those icy blue eyes. Neither of them moved. Neither of them breathed. Then, slowly, he lifted her hand to his lips, brushing the softest kiss against her knuckles. A shiver ran down her spine. "You're dangerous," she whispered. His lips curved into the faintest smirk. "So are you." Her heart pounded so hard she thought he might hear it. This was insane. This was wrong. And yet, for the first time in his life, Alexander Knight felt something he had never felt before. An ache in his chest, a deep, unfamiliar longing, and it terrified him because Emily Carter was the first woman who had ever made him feel anything at all. The warmth of the evening still lingered on Emily's skin as she stepped out of the restaurant with Alexander. The dinner had been unexpectedly perfect, full of stolen glances, teasing remarks, and a connection she hadn't believed possible. Could he really be different from the ruthless businessman the world painted him as? She wanted to believe it. As they walked to his car, the quiet hum of the city surrounded them. Alexander held the door open for her, his eyes searching hers as if waiting for something. What? She didn't know. Maybe a sign that she was falling for him. Maybe proof that he wasn't as heartless as he pretended to be. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe it too. But fate had a cruel way of reminding her exactly who he was. The drive to his office was quiet, save for the occasional hum of the city lights passing by. "I need to make a quick stop at my office," Alexander said, his voice smooth but distant. Emily frowned. "At this hour?" He smirked. "The world doesn't stop for billionaires." She rolled her eyes but didn't argue. After all, she was curious. What was his world really like? When they entered Knight Enterprises, the contrast was striking. The romantic warmth of the restaurant was replaced by a cold, calculated world of power and authority. Glass walls, polished floors, employees who kept their heads down as Alexander walked past. He didn't just own the place, he commanded it. And they feared him. Emily noticed it immediately. The stiff backs, the rushed greetings, the nervous glances, and that was when she saw it. A middle-aged man stood outside Alexander's office, wringing his hands. His salt-and-pepper hair looked disheveled, and there was panic in his eyes. "Mr. Knight, please," the man begged the moment Alexander approached. Emily slowed her steps, her stomach twisting. Alexander didn't blink. "You already know why you're here, Richard." The man swallowed hard. I just need more time. I've been loyal to this company for 20 years. My wife is sick. My son is in college. I can fix the numbers. Just a little more time, I swear." Alexander's face remained unreadable. "You were given time," he said coolly. Richard's hands trembled. "I made a mistake, but you made an unacceptable mistake," Alexander cut in. His voice was calm, but there was a lethal edge beneath it. "Sir, You're fired," Alexander said flatly. Emily's breath caught. The words were spoken so effortlessly, so coldly, as if he were discussing the weather. Richard paled, eyes widening in pure devastation. "Please, I don't have anything else. I'll lose my house." Alexander didn't even flinch. "Security will escort you out." Richard's lips trembled as his eyes darted between Emily and Alexander, as if searching for any last shred of mercy. There was none. Emily felt sick. "Alexander," she whispered, stepping closer, "you don't have to do this." His gaze flicked to her, sharp and unreadable. "He failed." "He's a person," she shot back, "not just a mistake on a spreadsheet." Richard turned to her desperately. "Miss, please." Alexander's expression darkened. "Go home, Richard. You're done here." Two security guards appeared, gripping Richard's arms as they led him away. Emily watched, her heart aching, as the man's shoulders sagged under the weight of defeat. The moment the door closed, the silence was deafening. Emily turned to Alexander, her chest tight with disbelief. "How could you do that?" she asked, voice shaking. Alexander exhaled, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I did what needed to be done." She shook her head. "Number you didn't even blink. That man was begging and you—" "This is how business works, Emily." His voice was sharp now, irritated. "Sentiment doesn't belong here." She stared at him, as if seeing him for the first time. He wasn't just a billionaire. He was ruthless, unforgiving, cold. She had been falling for a man who had no heart. Her throat tightened. "Maybe I made a mistake coming here." His eyes flashed. "Don't." "Don't what?" she whispered. "Don't look at me like I'm a monster." She flinched at the rawness in his voice, but she couldn't ignore what she had seen. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, barely above a whisper. For the first time, something flickered in his expression, something that almost looked like pain. But then, just as quickly, he shut it down. His jaw hardened. "Then leave!" Emily's heart cracked at his cold dismissal. Without another word, she turned and walked away. And this time, he didn't stop her. Alexander stood there long after she was gone, his fists clenched at his sides. Why did this bother him? He had fired hundreds of people before. He had built an empire on steel and stone, not emotions. So why did watching Emily walk away feel like a punch to the gut? He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He should let her go. She was too soft, too full of light, and he was darkness. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he wanted to stay in the dark anymore. And that realization terrified him. Emily had tried to forget him. She had walked out of his office, determined to leave him behind, to erase the ruthless, cold-hearted billionaire from her mind. But Alexander Knight was not a man you simply forgot. He lingered, in her thoughts, in her skin, in the ache in her chest whenever she closed her eyes. She hated that she still felt drawn to him, because she had seen his darkness, and yet she had also glimpsed something beneath it, something broken, something that made her wonder. Was there more to Alexander than the man the world feared? And that dangerous thought was why she found herself standing outside his building, drenched from the unexpected storm, heart hammering in her chest. She hadn't meant to come here. She had been walking home when the sky cracked open, rain pouring down in heavy sheets. The streets had emptied quickly, leaving her alone in the storm, and yet somehow her feet had led her here, to him, as if he had been waiting for her. And when the glass doors of Knight Enterprises swung open, revealing the very man she had tried to escape, she knew fate wasn't done with them. Alexander stopped the moment he saw her. His sharp suit was untouched by the rain, his expression unreadable, but his eyes burned as they met hers. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The rain pounded around them, drenching Emily's clothes, making her shiver. But it wasn't the cold that sent a tremor down her spine. It was him. He exhaled sharply, stepping closer. "What are you doing here?" Emily opened her mouth, but no words came. What was she doing here? She had sworn to walk away, to forget him. And yet, here she was, standing in the storm, aching for something she didn't understand. She should leave. She should walk away. But when he reached out, when his fingers brushed against her damp cheek, she knew she was too far gone. "Emily," he murmured, his voice lower, rougher than she had ever heard. Her name on his lips was her undoing. With a shaky breath, she whispered, "Tell me I should go." Alexander's jaw tightened, his hands balled into fists, as if fighting something deep inside. But then, his restraint snapped. In the next heartbeat, his hands were in her hair, his lips crashing against hers. The world fell away. The rain poured around them, soaking their skin, but neither of them cared, because in that moment, nothing else existed. His kiss was desperate, raw, and unrelenting, as if he had been starving for her, fighting this pull between them for too long. And Emily, she had never felt anything like it. She clung to him, her fingers digging into his suit as heat curled through her veins. Her heart pounded, her breath hitched. She knew this was dangerous. She knew he could destroy her. But for once, she didn't care. She kissed him back, letting the fire between them consume her. A moment of weakness, or something more. When they finally pulled apart, their breaths were ragged, their foreheads resting together as the rain continued to fall. Alexander's hands still cradled her face, his thumb brushing over her lips that were swollen from his kiss. His chest rose and fell as he studied her, as if memorizing every inch of her expression. "This is a mistake," he murmured, his voice hoarse. Emily swallowed hard. "Then why don't you stop?" His jaw clenched, his hands trembled slightly against her skin, and then, softly, he admitted, "Because I don't want to." Her heart stalled. For the first time, Alexander Knight had let his walls slip. For the first time, she saw the man beneath the power, the control, the reputation. And that terrified her more than anything, because she wasn't just falling for him, she was drowning in him, and she wasn't sure if she ever wanted to come up for air. Emily knew she shouldn't have been snooping. She had promised herself she wouldn't get too close to Alexander's world. And yet, ever since that night, their kiss in the rain, she hadn't been able to shake the feeling that there was more to him. Something hidden beneath his cold exterior, something broken. And tonight, as she sat curled up in his luxurious study, flipping through one of his books while he took a business call in the next room, she stumbled upon it, a letter. A fragile yellowed envelope tucked between the pages, as if it had been hidden there deliberately. Her fingers hesitated over the delicate paper. She shouldn't. But her heart was pounding, and against all reason she slid the letter out and unfolded it. What she read shattered her. "Alexander, I don't know if you'll ever read this. Maybe you won't even care. But I have to say it anyway. I'm sorry. I was selfish, and I hurt you in a way I can never take back. I should have fought harder. I should have stayed. But I was a coward. You told me love was a weakness. But I think you knew, even then, that it was a lie. Because I saw it in your eyes. You loved me too. And I left you anyway. Please, if you ever think of me again, don't let it be with anger. You deserved better than what I gave you. I just hope someday you find someone who is brave enough to love you the way I couldn't. Isabella." Emily's breath hitched. Her hands trembled as she stared at the name. Isabella. Who was she? And more importantly, what had she done to Alexander? The door to the study swung open and Emily jolted, shoving the letter back into the book. Too late, Alexander was already watching her. His sharp blue eyes flickered to her hands, to the book she was gripping too tightly, and something shifted in his expression. "Emily," he said slowly, his voice suddenly devoid of warmth. "What are you doing?" Her throat was dry. But she couldn't lie. Not when she had just read his past. "I found a letter," she admitted softly, "from Isabella." The room froze. Alexander's entire body tensed, his face turning to stone. For the first time, she saw real anger flicker in his gaze. "Put it back," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Who was she?" Emily pressed, unable to stop herself. "She said she left you, that she hurt you." His jaw clenched. "I said put it back." Emily's heart ached. "Alexander, talk to me." But he was already turning away, retreating into the icy walls he had spent his life building. "I don't owe you an explanation." Her stomach twisted. "But you do, because you kissed me like I meant something to you, and now you're shutting me out." His hands fisted at his sides. "You're right," he said coldly. "That was a mistake." Emily staggered back as if he had physically struck her. A mistake. That was all she'd been to him. Her voice cracked. "Then why are you still looking at me like that?" His nostrils flared. His eyes, despite his cruel words, burned with undeniable conflict, because he wanted her, and yet he refused to let her in. "Go home, Emily," he said, his voice raw. Tears stung her eyes, but she lifted her chin. "If I walk out now, I'm not coming back." Silence. A muscle ticked in his jaw. His breathing was uneven, but he didn't stop her, and that broke her more than anything else. So, without another word, Emily turned and walked away, and this time she forced herself not to look back. The door slammed shut, leaving Alexander standing in the suffocating silence of his study, his fingers curled into his palms, his chest tight. Emily was gone. Because of him. Because of his past. His eyes flickered to the bookshelf, to the book where that damned letter had been hidden for years, a ghost of a woman he once thought he could love. Isabella. A name he hadn't spoken in a long time, a name that still had the power to wreck him, because once upon a time she had taught him the most painful lesson of his life. That love wasn't just a weakness, it was a weapon, and he had vowed never to be vulnerable again. But then Emily happened, and now he wasn't so sure if he was still the same man who could live without love. The problem was, he might have already lost the only woman who could prove him wrong. Emily had told herself she wouldn't look back. She had walked away from Alexander, from his coldness, from the painful truth that he refused to let her in. But the letter haunted her. Isabella. Who was she? Why did her name wound Alexander so deeply? And more importantly, was Emily just another mistake waiting to happen? The questions refused to leave her mind. She had to know the truth, even if it shattered her. The next morning, Emily sat in a quiet cafe, her laptop open in front of her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She hesitated. This felt wrong. Digging into Alexander's past when he had made it clear he didn't want her to. But he had left her no choice. She needed answers. Taking a deep breath, she typed, "Isabella and Alexander Knight." The search results loaded instantly, and Emily's heart stopped. There it was, a photo. A younger Alexander, his hair slightly longer, his face a little less guarded, standing beside a beautiful woman with striking green eyes and dark hair that fell in perfect waves over her shoulders. She was smiling. He wasn't. Emily's stomach twisted as she clicked on an article. Isabella Laurent and Alexander Knight, a love story turned scandal. Her eyes scanned the words, her pulse pounding. Once, Alexander Knight was not the ruthless billionaire we know today. Years ago, he was deeply involved with Isabella Laurent, the daughter of an influential investor. Their relationship was the talk of the elite. Alexander, the young and powerful businessman, and Isabella, the enchanting beauty at his side. Sources say Alexander was ready to propose. But just weeks before their engagement, Isabella was caught in a scandal that shook the business world. She was exposed for leaking confidential information from Knight Enterprises to one of Alexander's biggest competitors. The betrayal nearly cost Alexander his empire. When confronted, Isabella didn't deny it. Instead, she disappeared, leaving behind nothing but a letter asking for his forgiveness. After that, Alexander changed. The man who once believed in love turned cold, ruthless, untouchable, and he has never been the same since. Emily felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. She closed her laptop, her hands trembling. Now it all made sense. Why Alexander didn't believe in love, why he had pushed her away, because he'd already given his heart to someone once, and she had destroyed him. Emily walked aimlessly through the city, the cold air biting at her skin. Was she just another distraction for him? Another woman he would throw away the moment she got too close, or worse? Did he even care for her at all? She had seen the way he looked at her, the way he had kissed her in the rain as if he needed her. But maybe it wasn't her he needed. Maybe he just wanted something to fill the emptiness Isabella had left behind. The thought broke her. Tears blurred her vision, but she quickly wiped them away. She had to be strong. She wouldn't let herself become just another woman who loved Alexander Knight and lost. Meanwhile, Alexander stood in his penthouse, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He hadn't slept, not since Emily walked out, not since he saw the pain in her eyes when he told her their kiss had been a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. It was the realest thing he had ever felt. But he couldn't tell her that, because he had been here before. He had let a woman in before, and it had nearly destroyed him. He downed the whiskey, but it did nothing to numb the ache in his chest. Emily was different. She wasn't Isabella, but what if he was still the same man? What if he let her in and lost himself all over again? He couldn't afford that risk, because Alexander Knight didn't survive on love. He survived on power, control, and never letting anyone close enough to hurt him again. So why did letting Emily go feel like the biggest mistake of his life? That night, as Emily lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, she knew she had a choice. She could walk away from Alexander Knight forever, or she could fight to break through the walls he had spent years building. But the real question was, did she want to risk her heart for a man who might never be able to love her back? Emily had promised herself she wouldn't get close to Alexander again. She had seen the scars of his past. She knew that Isabella's betrayal had turned him into the cold, ruthless man the world feared. But despite all of that, she had started to believe that she was different, that maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to let her in. Over the past few weeks, Alexander had softened around her. He still wasn't the kind of man who spoke about his feelings, but his actions spoke louder than words. The way his hand would linger on hers for a second too long. The way his eyes darkened with something undeniable when she laughed. The way he pulled her against him when he thought she was asleep, as if he needed her close but couldn't admit it while she was awake. She had started to think that he cared, that what they had was real. Until tonight, until everything shattered. Emily had just entered Alexander's office. She had brought him coffee, a small gesture, but one that felt right. But as she approached his door, she heard voices. His voice, and someone else's. She hesitated, not wanting to intrude. But then, a sentence. A cold, sharp sentence that sent a dagger straight through her heart. She's perfect for this, Alex. The press adores her, sweet, innocent. She'll make the company look good for the merger. A relationship with her will soften your image. Emily's breath hitched. A pause. Then Alexander's voice, smooth and unreadable. I know. She felt the floor collapse beneath her. She trusts you, and that's exactly what we need, his business partner continued. You play this right and we secure the deal. Simple. Alexander's response was calm. Too calm. It's already working. The coffee cup slipped from Emily's fingers. It hit the floor with a shattering crash. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then the door swung open, and there he was, Alexander Knight, The man who had kissed her in the rain, who had held her like she was something precious. The man she had almost let herself fall for. His sharp blue eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw it. Not warmth, not the man she thought she was starting to know, but calculated control. Coldness. Just like the billionaire everyone said he was, just like the man Isabella had left behind. Emily took a step back, her chest aching. "You were using me," she whispered. His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He didn't deny it. And that silence hurt more than any words ever could. She felt like a fool, a complete, pathetic fool. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she turned and walked away. This time, for good. Emily didn't stop walking, not when she reached the elevator, not when she stepped out onto the street, not even when the first drops of rain began to fall, mirroring the storm inside her. How could she have been so blind? She had let him in. She had trusted him. And all along she had been nothing but a pawn in his game. Her heart felt like it was breaking, piece by painful piece. She had given him every chance to prove he was different, to show her that she mattered. But in the end, she was just another deal to him, just like Isabella had been, and Emily wasn't about to stick around and watch history repeat itself. She wiped at her tears angrily, forcing herself to be strong. She was done. This time, she was really, truly done. Alexander stood in the doorway of his office, staring at the shattered coffee cup on the floor. His hands were tight fists at his sides. His business partner sighed. She wasn't supposed to hear that. Alexander didn't respond, because for the first time in years he felt something terrifying, something he had sworn never to feel again. Regret. He had told himself that keeping Emily at a distance was necessary, that allowing her to believe in something but false was better than letting her get too close. But now, as he watched her disappear into the night, he realized he had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and this time he might not get the chance to fix it. Alexander Knight was a man who owned the world. Power, wealth, influence, he had it all. People feared him, respected him, did whatever it took to please him, and yet none of that mattered. Not when the one thing he wanted was slipping away from him. Emily. Ever since she had walked out that night, ever since she had disappeared from his life, a strange and unfamiliar emptiness had taken root inside him. He had told himself it was for the best, that she had only been a distraction, that he could go back to the life he knew, where emotions were buried, where attachments were weaknesses, and where no one could ever hurt him again. But no matter how many times he told himself that, the truth still burned. She was avoiding him, and he had no idea why. At first, he thought he was imagining it, but then came the missed calls, the unanswered texts, the sudden change in her routine. She no longer passed by his office. She no longer went to the places where he might run into her. And every time he reached out, he was met with nothing but silence. Alexander Knight was a man who never chased after anyone. So, why the hell was he standing here, staring at his phone, waiting for a response that would never come? Emily told herself that she was done, that she would never make the mistake of loving a man like Alexander Knight again. Because love was a lie. She had seen the truth with her own eyes. She had heard his voice, the cold calculation in his words. It's already working. That was all she needed to know. She had been nothing but a pawn in his game, just like Isabella. and she refused to be another name on his list of regrets. So she did what she did best. She ran, she threw herself into her art, painting for hours at a time until her hands were covered in color and exhaustion numbed the ache in her chest. She avoided the places where she might see him. She ignored his calls. She pretended he didn't exist. But no matter how much she tried to forget, she couldn't, because he was everywhere. In the soft brush of the wind against her skin, in the midnight blue hues she painted without thinking, in the sound of rain against her window that reminded her of the night he had kissed her like she was his entire world. And that was the most painful part, because for one fleeting moment she had believed him. She had let herself hope. And now she was paying the price. Alexander wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to feeling this way, restless, angry, frustrated beyond reason, but most of all, empty. He sat in his office, staring at the city skyline, but he wasn't really seeing it. His mind was somewhere else, with her. He told himself that this was temporary, that he would get over it, that Emily was just another woman, another fleeting attachment that would fade with time. But as the days turned into weeks and she still refused to answer his calls, refused to look at him, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Panic, because she was slipping away. And he didn't know how to stop it. One evening, he found himself parked outside her apartment building. The light in her window flickered softly against the night sky. He had no idea why he was there. All he knew was that something inside him ached. A hollow, suffocating ache that refused to go away. She was moving on without him, and for the first time in years, Alexander felt the sharp, unbearable sting of losing something that actually mattered. But still, he did nothing, because his pride held him back. Because if he went to her now, if he admitted the truth, if he told her that she wasn't just another business move, that she wasn't just a distraction, then he would have to admit that he had fallen for her. And Alexander Knight didn't believe in love, not anymore, not since Isabella. So he clenched his jaw, turned on the ignition, and drove away, even though every bone in his body screamed at him to stay. Emily stood by her window, watching the rain fall against the glass. Her heart ached, because she knew. She felt it. He had been here, somewhere in the shadows, watching, just like he had always done. And for a brief, painful moment she almost ran after him, almost threw open the door and demanded answers. But she didn't, because she was done chasing ghosts. If Alexander wanted her, if he truly wanted her, then he would have to fight for her. And she wasn't sure he ever would. Days passed, weeks. Emily waited, but he never came. And that silence was the final answer. Maybe Alexander Knight had cared for her in his own way, but not enough. Not enough to choose her. Not enough to let go of his past, of his pride, of the walls he had built so high that no one, not even her, could reach him. And so, with a deep breath, Emily whispered her final goodbye to the man who had almost loved her. Then she picked up her bags and walked away from him forever. Or so she thought, because fate wasn't done with them yet. Emily had spent weeks convincing herself that leaving Alexander was the right decision, that he had betrayed her, that he had only seen her as a pawn in his game. But everything she thought she knew about that night, the night she walked away, her heart breaking, was a lie. And now, as she stood in the middle of her tiny art studio, holding a stack of emails and reports that proved the truth, she felt her knees weaken. She had been wrong, terribly, painfully wrong. It had all started with an unexpected visit, a woman one of Alexander's most trusted employees, had shown up at Emily's studio that afternoon, her expression tight with urgency. "I don't know if you'll believe me," she had said, "but I need you to hear this." Emily had almost shut the door in her face. She didn't want to talk about Alexander, didn't want to think about him, but something in the woman's eyes, something earnest, desperate, made her pause. And so she listened. And what she learned changed everything. The conversation she had overheard that night, the one that had destroyed everything between them, had been a misunderstanding. Yes, Alexander's business partner had been talking about using Emily to soften his image. Yes, he had made it sound like a strategic move. But what Emily hadn't known, what she hadn't stayed long enough to hear, was Alexander's response. "She's not part of the deal," he had said, his voice sharp, unyielding. "I won't use her, not for this, not for anything." "Then what's the point?" his partner had scoffed. "It doesn't matter. She matters," Alexander had said, "and I won't lose her over this." Emily staggered back, her heart pounding, her breath hitched as the words replayed in her mind. She had been so sure that he had betrayed her, so sure that he had only been playing a game, but she had been wrong. He had chosen her. He had been willing to risk everything for her, and she had walked away, without giving him a chance to explain, a sharp, suffocating guilt wrapped around her chest. She had judged him too quickly. She had left him alone in the storm. And now she didn't know if she could ever make it right. Meanwhile, Alexander Knight was drowning. Not in alcohol, not in reckless distractions. No, he drowned himself in work, in back-to-back meetings, endless negotiations, and the cold, sterile efficiency of his billion-dollar empire. He refused to let himself think about her, refused to acknowledge the ache that settled deep in his chest, the one that no amount of power or wealth could fix. She had made her choice. She had walked away, and Alexander Knight was not the kind of man who begged. So instead, he buried himself in work, shutting off the part of himself that still whispered her name in the silence of his empty penthouse. Still, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't erase her from his mind. Couldn't forget the way she laughed, soft and warm, like she had never been afraid of him. Couldn't forget the way she had looked at him, like she saw something in him that no one else did, something more than just a cold-hearted billionaire. But she was gone now, and he had no one to blame but himself. At least, that's what he thought. Until Emily showed up at his office unannounced. Emily hesitated outside his office, her heart hammering. Would he even listen to her? Would he forgive her? She had judged him, abandoned him. And she knew Alexander Knight was not a man who gave second chances easily. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door. His office was just as she remembered, sleek, elegant, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. But it wasn't the room that made her breath catch. It was him. He stood behind his desk, a sharp suit hugging his powerful frame, his blue eyes as cold as ice when they met hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, his voice cut through the silence like a blade. "What are you doing here?" Emily swallowed. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, imagined him softening, pulling her into his arms, telling her that it wasn't too late. But there was nothing soft about the way he looked at her now. There was only steel, only a man who had been hurt. "I know the truth," she said quietly, "about that night, about the conversation I overheard." A flicker of something flashed in his eyes, but it was gone before she could name it. "I made a mistake," she continued, Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away. "I should have let you explain. I should have trusted you, but instead, She exhaled shakily. "I left. And I'm sorry." Silence. A long, heavy silence. Then, "You're sorry?" His voice was cold, controlled. Emily flinched, because this was the moment she realized she had broken him too. She had expected him to be angry. But this emptiness, this quiet indifference, it scared her more than his rage ever could. "I don't know what you want me to say," he said finally, his expression unreadable. Her chest tightened. "Say that I didn't ruin everything." Another silence. Then, "I don't know if I can." Her heart cracked, because this was what she deserved, wasn't it? She had walked away first, and now maybe he was doing the same. Emily didn't know if there was still a future for them, didn't know if Alexander could ever forgive her. All she knew was that she had to fight for him, because she loved him. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid to say it. Emily stood outside Alexander Knight's office, her heart hammering inside her chest. She had faced rejection before, had been turned away, ridiculed, belittled. But nothing, not the years of struggling, not the pain of walking away from the man she loved. Nothing terrified her as much as the possibility that this time she had lost him forever. Her fingers trembled as she pushed open the heavy glass door. The receptionist looked startled but didn't stop her, maybe because she saw the desperation in Emily's eyes. Or maybe because everyone in this building knew Alexander had never been the same since she left. Taking a shaky breath, Emily stepped inside, and there he was. Cold, unreadable, distant. Her Alexander, no, not hers anymore, sat behind his sleek desk, his piercing blue eyes locked onto her with no warmth, no emotion. She almost turned around, almost ran, but she had already made the mistake of leaving once. She would not make it again. So she swallowed her fear and spoke. "I was wrong." Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to keep going. "I judged you too quickly. I didn't give you a chance to explain. I let my own insecurities, my own fears," she exhaled shakily. "I let them push you away." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his face as unreadable as ever. "And now?" His voice was calm, controlled. But beneath that cold exterior, she could feel it, the storm brewing inside him. "I want you back." The words ripped from her throat, leaving her breathless. "I don't care about your past. I don't care about your reputation. Her voice wavered. "I just care about you." She took a step closer. "Please, Alexander." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Tell me it's not too late." Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. Then, "No." Emily froze. Her heart stopped, her hands clenched into fists, trying to hold herself together. "You don't mean that?" His jaw tightened. "You think I don't?" She shook her head. "I know you, Alexander. I know you're angry. I know you're hurt. But I also know that what we had was real." "Was." He repeated the word slowly, as if tasting the bitterness of it. "You made your choice, Emily." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "And I regret it. Every day." Her voice cracked. "Please don't let my mistake ruin what we have." His mask didn't break, he didn't move, didn't reach for her, didn't soften. Emily's heart shattered. Because for the first time, she realized she might have lost him after all. Emily took a shaky step back. Maybe this was it. Maybe she had broken him too much. But then, something flickered in his eyes. A moment of hesitation, a crack in the ice. And before she could stop herself, she whispered, I love you. Alexander went rigid. His fingers tightened around the edge of his desk, his entire body stiff with tension. It was the first time she had said it, the first time she had let those words slip past her lips, the first time she had let herself be completely, utterly vulnerable. And she knew, right then and there, that this was her last chance. If he turned away now, if he let her go, she would walk out that door and never look back. Seconds passed, agonizing, excruciating. Then, suddenly, Alexander stood. His chair scraped against the marble floor as he moved toward her with slow, deliberate steps. Emily held her breath. Then he stopped, just inches away from her. His fingers brushed against her cheek, wiping away a single tear. And finally, his mask shattered. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. You love me? A tear slipped down her cheek. I do. Alexander inhaled sharply, his walls crumbling around him. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if trying to steady himself. Then he cupped her face in his hands, his thumb brushing over her trembling lips. I should hate you. His voice was low, raw with emotion. I tried to. Emily's breath hitched. But I can't. And then he kissed her. Hard. Desperate. Like he had been drowning without her. Like she was the only thing keeping him alive. Emily gasped against his lips, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. And for the first time in weeks, she felt like she was home. When they finally broke apart, both of them, breathless, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. His voice was a whisper. You left me. Tears filled her eyes. I know. I don't forgive. Easily. His fingers tightened on her waist. But I love you, Emily. Her heart stopped. It was the first time he had said it, the first time he had let down his walls completely. And in that moment she knew. They weren't just falling anymore. They had already fallen, beyond pride, beyond fear, beyond anything either of them had ever known. Emily let out a shaky laugh. So, does this mean you're giving me another chance? Alexander smirked, but this time there was warmth behind it. Don't push your luck, sweetheart. She laughed through her tears, pressing another kiss against his lips. And just like that, the walls that had once kept them apart came crashing down. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emily felt safe, loved. Alexander's arms wrapped around her as they stood on the penthouse balcony, the city lights flickering like distant stars below. She leaned into his warmth, closing her eyes, letting herself believe that this was real. That despite everything, the misunderstandings, the heartbreak, the pain, they had found their way back to each other. But love was never meant to be this easy for them, and fate was about to prove it. The headaches had started weeks ago. At first, Emily brushed them off. She was just tired, just stressed. But then came the dizziness, the faint spells, the unexplained weakness in her hands when she painted. Still, she ignored it. Until one morning, when she collapsed in her studio. When she woke up, she was in the hospital, a doctor standing over her with a look she would never forget. And then came the words that shattered her world. Miss Carter, we need to talk about your test results. Her fingers clenched the bedsheet. It's a rare condition, degenerative, difficult to treat. Difficult to treat, not impossible, but not curable either. Her mind went blank. The doctor kept talking, explaining procedures, medications, possibilities. But all Emily could think was, how do I tell him? How do I tell the man I love that after everything we fought for, after everything we suffered to be together, I might not have much time left? Emily didn't tell him. She couldn't. Not after everything Alexander had been through, not after Isabella, the woman who had once betrayed him, had shattered his ability to trust. Not after Emily had walked away from him once, and only just found her way back. So she hid it. She pretended nothing was wrong. She smiled through the pain, through the nausea, through the fatigue that clung to her like a shadow. She lied to him every time he asked if she was okay, because if she told him, if she saw the look of helplessness in his eyes, she knew it would break her more than the illness ever could. But Alexander Knight was not a fool, and he knew Emily too well. He noticed the way she trembled when she thought he wasn't looking, the way she flinched when he touched her hand, as if even the softest brush of his fingers hurt. The way her once bright laughter had become hollow, forced. And the final crack, the moment his suspicion turned into undeniable fear, was when he walked into her studio one night and found her curled up on the floor, clutching her stomach in silent agony. "Emily?" His voice was sharp, laced with panic. She jumped, scrambling to stand, forcing a smile. Alex, what are you doing here?" His entire body tensed. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, She took a step back. "I tripped, that's all." Lie. A blatant, desperate lie. His eyes darkened. "Don't lie to me." She swallowed hard. "I'm fine." "Emily." His voice dropped, low and deadly. "Tell me the truth." She opened her mouth, but she couldn't shatter the illusion that they were finally happy. So she said nothing. And then Alexander's gaze fell to the table beside her, to the pile of medical reports scattered carelessly across the surface, to the words printed in bold black ink: rare degenerative disorder, progressive, limited treatment options. His breath hitched. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, carefully, Alexander picked up the papers, read them, and when he finally looked back at her, his hands clenched around the edges of the report, his voice was nothing but a whisper. "How long have you known?" Emily's heart stopped. She tried to speak, but the lump in her throat was too thick. The look on his face, the sheer devastation, the betrayal, was unbearable. I didn't want to worry you," she choked out. Alexander laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "Didn't want to worry me?" His jaw tightened, his grip on the papers shaking. "So what? You were just going to pretend. Keep smiling until one day you couldn't get up anymore?" Tears burned in her eyes. "I didn't know how to tell you," she whispered. "I was scared." His breath was uneven. Scared of what? Her lips trembled. "That you'd leave." The words were barely audible, but the moment they left her lips, Alexander shattered, his face twisted with something raw, something painful, and then he moved. In a heartbeat, he closed the distance between them, cupping her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. His voice was hoarse, filled with unspoken agony. "Emily," he breathed, "do you really think so little of me?" Tears slipped down her cheeks. "I didn't want to be a burden." His hands tightened on her face. "You're not a burden." His voice cracked. "You are the only thing that has ever mattered to me." Her breath hitched. For a moment, she could see it. The fear in his eyes. Not fear of losing her love, but fear of losing her. "I don't care how hard this gets," he whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. "I don't care how much time we have. I'm not leaving you." A sob broke from her lips. And suddenly she was in his arms, clinging to him, her body shaking with all the fear, all the pain, all the love she had been holding in for so long. Alexander held her tighter, as if letting go would break him. For the longest time, they just stood there, wrapped in each other, surrounded by the weight of what was coming. Then Alexander spoke. "We'll fight this." His voice was firm, unwavering. "I don't care how rare it is, I don't care how difficult." He pulled back, his eyes fierce, unshakable. "We're going to beat this. Together." Emily let out a shaky breath. She wanted to believe him. Needed to believe him, so she did the only thing she could. She nodded and whispered, "Together." The sky was heavy with dark clouds, thunder rumbling in the distance. It was the kind of night that reminded Emily of the first time she met Alexander, the night he had stopped in the middle of a storm to help a stranger with her paintings. Back then, she had thought he was nothing more than a cold, ruthless billionaire. Now, as she sat beside him in his sleek black car, she knew the truth. Alexander wasn't cold. He wasn't ruthless. He was afraid of losing the only person who had ever made him feel alive. Emily turned to him, her fingers brushing against his hand on the gear shift. "Where are we going?" she asked softly. Alexander didn't look at her, but his grip on the wheel tightened. "You'll see." Outside, the storm raged, rain pounding against the windows, lightning slicing through the sky. And yet, despite the chaos around them, Emily felt calm. Because no matter what happened next, she knew one thing. She wasn't alone anymore. When Alexander finally stopped the car, Emily gasped. They were back. The place where it all began. The empty street where his car had broken down, the very spot where she had struggled with her paintings, rain soaking her to the bone. The place where he had first looked at her and felt something shift inside him. Alexander stepped out without a word, walking into the rain. Emily hesitated for only a second before following him. The moment she stepped into the storm, the cold rain soaked through her dress, her hair clinging to her face, but she barely noticed, because Alexander was standing there, staring at her with something raw, something desperate in his eyes. And then, "I love you." Emily froze. The words weren't new. He had said them before, but this time something was different, because for the first time there was no fear in his voice, no hesitation, no walls, just love. Pure, unshakable, undeniable love. "I don't care how much time we have," he continued, stepping closer. "A year, 10 years, a lifetime. It doesn't matter." His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs brushing away the raindrops. Or were they tears? "All I care about is you," he whispered, "loving you, making you happy. Because, Emily—" His voice broke. "You changed me." Emily let out a shaky breath. "I thought I had everything," he continued. "Wealth, power, control. But none of it meant anything. Not until you." A sob escaped her lips. She had spent so much time worrying about the future, about how much time they had left, that she had forgotten to just live. But Alexander, her Alexander, had found the courage to do what she couldn't, to choose love, to choose her. She reached for him, her fingers trembling. "You make me happy, Alexander." His breath hitched. She stepped closer, pressing her forehead against his. "And as long as I have you, I have everything." The words barely left her lips before Alexander's mouth crashed onto hers. The rain poured around them, the storm roaring, but all Emily felt was him so that were desperate, urgent, full of promises he would never break. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid, because no matter what the future held, one thing was certain: they would face it together. When they finally broke apart, Alexander rested his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in the cold night air. Then he did something Emily never expected. He laughed. A soft, genuine, heart-wrenching laugh. And when he looked at her, there was no trace of the cold-hearted billionaire she had once feared. Just a man who had once been lost. A man who had finally found his way home. Emily smiled through her tears. "What now?" she whispered. Alexander brushed a wet strand of hair from her cheek. "Now," he smirked, "now I dedicate the rest of my life to making you happy." Emily's heart swelled because she knew he meant every word. And as the rain continued to pour, as he pulled her into his arms, she finally understood. Love wasn't about forever. It was about this moment. And right now, in his arms, under the stormy sky, she had everything she ever needed.